Hello, U.S. History, and welcome to another Varela's videos. Today we're going to be looking at America entering the war. So we've talked about how the war has been going on for 2 years in Europe, and so let's look at how the United States enters the war. I know you already know how, but let's go through some of the details. So the year is 1941. We know that the Axis powers control most of Europe. So they currently are pretty much winning this war at this point. We know that the French have been sort of put on a timeout by the Germans taking over Paris. So what we're looking at is what is happening in 1941. So, in terms of our involvement, back in March of 1941, this is a very important act here. This will be on your test. Congress decides to authorize the Lend-Lease Act. Now, this act, as you can see here by the definition, it doesn't commit soldiers, but it does commit and allow the United States to send or lend materials to any country whose defense the president deems vital to the defense of the United States. So, what does that mean? Basically, FDR knows the British need help desperately. Now, at this point, it's the British sort of all on their own. Even the Soviet Union is not really in this fight officially when we think of March of 1941. They will be in the fight as of June. So the British need any help they can get. And FDR uses a very famous example of a fire hose. And basically, he gives the example to Congress. If your neighbor's house was on fire, your next door neighbor, and they asked to come borrow your hose to put out the fire, do you argue over the price? Do you deny the neighbor the use of your fire hose? Because obviously, if they don't put the fire out, where is that fire going to go? Your house. And so FDR is trying to equate Europe on fire, the German takeover by the Nazis, as basically we have to help the British, otherwise the Nazis could come to the US. So the Lend-Lease Act is passed in 1941, and I have to tell you, FDR really sees an opportunity to get in this war with the Lend-Lease Act. This is the first step. FDR also really would like to see Hitler defeated. So he is going to try any way he can, honestly, to get us into this war because he is so worried about this German takeover of Europe. But more on that later. So that's March of 1941. Let's come down here to August. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill, the new Prime Minister of England, have a secret meeting. They actually meet off the coast of Nova Scotia on an aircraft carrier, so obviously up near Canada. And they are going to sign what now became known as the Atlantic Charter. So this is a very important document. It basically is saying that the US will help basically get in this war soon and that we must create an international system of security. Basically, the Atlantic Charter is a secret promise. The US is in this war soon. Just give us some time. The American people are very isolationist at this point. We don't want to get in this fight. This is not our fight. People are still burned from World War II. Plus, we are still technically in the Great Depression. So, this is the last thing that many Americans want because, in their minds, it has not affected us personally yet. So, this is a promise that the US and Great Britain make that not only will the US help, but we need to create something better than the League of Nations. And this is where the idea for the United Nations first happens. And we know the United Nations will be a reality shortly after World War II is over. Okay, so moving on, we know that Japan attacking the United States is how the US gets involved in World War II. You've known this pretty much since elementary school. So let's talk about the reasons behind the attack. So the Japanese and the US have sort of been kind of, going toe to toe with one another throughout Asia for the last decade. Basically, Japan wants all European possessions in Asia, specifically Southeast Asia. That also includes the Philippines. And the US at this point still has the Philippines as a colony, and we do not want to lose it to the Japanese. So, we realize that Japan is an island, a series of islands, and they have limited natural resources. So we are going to begin to try and show Japan who's boss by banning the sale of any war materials to Japan. And we mean in terms of our US businesses, and that includes oil. So we call this an embargo. And an embargo is basically a refusal to sell certain items. So in this case, the Japanese are not allowed to purchase oil from the US. And this is a big deal for the Japanese because they need oil. And so they're going to have to try to find someplace else to buy it. But what this is also trying to do is intimidate the Japanese. And the problem is it doesn't work. It just angers the Japanese. So what ends up happening is our tensions between the US and Japan continue to grow. Now, nothing has happened. Throughout the 1930s, we know that Japan has invaded China, and the US is trying to protect China without actually having to send military there. But this is sort of going to end up with a showdown eventually between the US and the Japanese. The problem is, total honesty here, the US does not view Japan really as a threat. We view Japan more as an annoyance. And here's the problem. Japan is a threat. We are totally underestimating them. Okay, so let's talk about what happens at Pearl Harbor. The general who's sort of behind most of the planning is named General Tojo Hideki. He is going to order a surprise attack on the island of Oahu. So we know the attack happens on a Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941. The Japanese do, in fact, bomb Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu. We declare war on Japan on December 8th, the very next day. And we're going to listen to FDR's speech in class. But I want to point out a couple things about this attack. Obviously, if you've been to the Pearl Harbor Memorial in Oahu, it is one of the most, I want to say serene. I don't want to say beautiful because that's not the right word, but solemn, I think is a good word. Memorials I have ever seen. It does have the USS Arizona at the bottom of the harbor. It's still there. There are still sailors on board. They are sort of entombed in that battleship that sank. The Japanese attacked battleships, they attacked airplanes, but two things they did not attack. They did not attack oil reserves that were nearby, and they did not attack aircraft carriers. And I think because those two items were spared, this is what allows the US Navy to rebuild and still be in this fight. And the Japanese kind of realized that if they wanted to knock the US out quickly, a surprise attack is the way to do it. It just wasn't the huge blow they were anticipating. So the US Navy, as we know, will rebound. But this was definitely an attack that the US did not see coming. And partly, we'll talk about the diplomatic reasons behind that when we listen to FDR's speech. But just to tell you, if this was December, we had Japanese negotiators in Washington, D.C. in October talking about peace. And in reality, back home in Japan, they were planning this attack. So, it's a surprise. It's a little shady. It's also a surprise. Now, the moment we declare war on Japan, because of the Tripartite Pact, Germany and Italy declare war on the US. So really, by December 15th, it is on like Donkey Kong because we are now officially in World War II. And ironically, we are attacked by the Japanese when FDR was convinced Hitler and his submarines would attack US warships, sending supplies to the British. And instead, the attack comes in Hawaii. But this is the United States officially getting involved in World War II. And what we're going to look at, here's a newspaper headline: Oahu bombed by Japanese planes. This is the Honolulu Star. So this is, in fact, we know for sure that there ended up being about over 1,000 casualties. So it's a huge attack. It was one of our more deadliest domestic attacks up until September 11th. So it was a big deal, and it was so shocking that we just didn't see it coming. Now, some argue we could have. There's rumors of codes that were intercepted, and there were airplanes that were picked up on radar, but everything kind of has a reasonable explanation. We just missed it. I mean, plain and simple. So what happens? So obviously the attack is going to create a huge series, a sort of spirit of patriotism. And Americans, whether they are young or old, are really mobilized for this war effort. So starting in 1940, really end of 1942, you can see our military is going to grow quite a bit. The Army will increase from 1.4 million to 3 million soldiers. The Navy, which had before under 300,000, is going to double to more than 600,000 sailors. And the Marine Corps will grow from 54,000 up to 150,000 Marines. World War II will be one of the first wars where you will see multiple ethnic and racial backgrounds serving. Now, I will tell you the armed forces are still segregated. That means that white soldiers serve with white soldiers, black soldiers serve with black soldiers, Japanese soldiers will serve with Japanese soldiers because, yes, we will have Japanese American soldiers fighting in this war on the US side. But they are segregated, they are in separate units. Women are a huge part of World War II, and we will talk about that. This is the Rosie the Riveter image, the women going into the workplace. The difference will be that women will stay in the workplace following World War II. In terms of industry, especially here in Southern California, you're going to see the booming sort of military aircraft industry. You're going to start to see factories built all over the West Coast to build war supplies, machinery for the war, ammunitions, and so forth. So there's a huge sort of military industry created. And there might be some problems with that we see in the 1950s, but we'll get to that later. Also, another way to help contribute is this idea of rationing, which was, as you can see, the definition is here, government controlled limits on the amount of certain goods that civilians could buy. There were actual rationing books issued, like coupons, and in order to buy meat, you had to have a coupon or sugar, and it was really a way of limiting what people could buy, and that was so the resources that are saved could be used for the war effort. So people didn't mind rationing. They felt it was like their civic duty, their patriotic duty. So World War II, I think coming off the Great Depression was, I think, especially in a way unifying our people because we had just come out of such a dark time with the Depression, and war is still dark, but it was almost like we had a different enemy. This was a personal enemy, the German enemy, the Japanese enemy, and not the economy. I'm going to end here with the Pacific because I'll be honest, after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese don't stop. As you can see here in this map, all of the red areas throughout Asia and Southeast Asia, all of these red areas are going to fall to Japan. And look at here's the Philippines. We'll talk about the Philippines in our next notes. But basically, what Japan wanted, they get. They will get most of Southeast Asia under their control. And really, by 1942, they have created a massive empire in the Pacific. It stretches from Southeast Asia all the way to the western part of the Pacific Ocean. Basically, all of these islands here up until Hawaii. Now, of course, beyond attacking Pearl Harbor, the Japanese don't take over Hawaii, but they take over dozens and dozens of islands between Hawaii and the Philippines. So if you had to say like round one, Japan wins. So this is where we are. Pretty much by the end of the year 1942. So we're going to see how the Americans sort of fight back. All right, I'm going to leave you here, U.S. history. So hopefully you took some good notes, and then I will see you in class.